The moment that I set foot on the pier in 1989, I felt like I was home. The pier has always had a relationship with the arts, literally since the day that it opened. And it's not widely known. I mean, the pier, when it opened, was actually a public utility. It was built to run sewage out into the ocean. That's, cities don't build amusement parks. They build utilities to make everybody's life a little bit more palatable, I guess. And so we had a public utility for the Santa Monica Pier. However, it was the first ever pier on the west coast of the United States that was made entirely of concrete. So there was a lot of celebration around it. It was distinct, it was special, and Santa Monica was very proud of that. There were parades, there were races, there was music. And there was a play. It's a tableau vivant called The Surrender of Rex Neptune. It played out as Rex Neptune jumps up onto the pier, and he's very excited because he's going to tear this pier down like he did every other pier with his storms. And Queen Santa Monica comes out and says, "Oh no, not this pier." Rex Neptune looks down, realizes he's standing on a concrete pier, admits his defeat, and he's cast out to the ocean in a sea of flames. And that sea of flames at the time was a fireworks show. From September 9th, 1909, there's always been an art presence here at the pier. I left a depressed area of western Colorado. It had been through the oil shale bust. When I got to the pier in 1989, the west end of the pier had been destroyed by storms. People who were still left were very clingy to one another, and it was a very, very much a family feeling. So I was welcomed as part of that family from the moment I set foot on the Santa Monica Pier. So the pier was nothing like it is today. There was no west end, so there was no pier experience of walking out over the ocean. There was no amusement park. The people who were coming to the pier at that time were summer tourists who were just using the pier as a bridge to get to the beach. There was a lot of gang activity here at the pier. There were a lot of homeless. There was also a group of people, they'd been coming to the pier their entire lives. And they would walk into the boathouse restaurant where I worked, and over coffee or drinks, they would start telling me about what the pier used to be like. Becoming a pretty wise bartender quickly, I learned that the best way to make $1 was to listen. So I absorbed all those stories that people were telling me and fell in love with an entirely different pier than I had first walked upon. Well, I've been a playwright since college, and so an instant inspiration for me was, of course, the Santa Monica Pier, and I worked that into my early works frequently. While I was working on the history book about the Santa Monica Pier, I was fascinated with the story of how the community rallied to save it in 1972 and 1973. The city had decided to tear down the pier in favor of building a man-made island. The entire story is the little guy versus the developers, which is an ongoing story even today. It's a fantastic story of how participating in civic engagement can have very positive results. After I finished writing the book, I immediately started working on this play. I was writing it to be performed on traditional stage. And the play is set, all the action is set in a little cafe on the Santa Monica Pier and in the city council chambers. And as I was writing it, I was finding that I wasn't putting the pier into the play at all. You couldn't see, you didn't know, the pier wasn't really a part of it. It was just two locations. One day I was sitting out at the end of the Santa Monica Pier, up in the bleachers out at the end, and I looked down and I imagined table and chairs on one side and a podium on the other, representing the cafe, city council, and I couldn't get the pier out of the play. It was the perfect location for that play, and that's a play that we do annually now every spring. It's called Save the Pier. When Charles Loof came on board and built a wide part of the pier with all of, at that time, an amusement park and certainly the merry-go-round building, he built a special concert pavilion. So there were live concerts from 1916 until about 1922. And then in 1924, a new lessee of Charles Louf's property extended the wide part of the pier and built the largest ballroom in the world, the La Monica Ballroom. It opened to great fanfare, to 50,000 people coming to see it in July of 1924. The cause of the first ever recorded traffic jam in Santa Monica. It was that popular. In 1948, it hosted the first ever live broadcast of a variety show. Throughout the Santa Monica Pier's first 40 years, there were a lot of wonderful arts activities. And then continuing into the 50s, Walter Hopps curated an art show inside the merry-go-round, and it was called Action. And today that's still recognized as one of the most important works of his life. He became a very famous arts curator afterward. And today, of course, we know the concerts, and we have outdoor movies. We've had many movies shot on the pier. We're even doing live theater out on the pier. So it's over 100 years of arts activity on the Santa Monica Pier. About 10 years ago, I wrote a very personal play about my relationship with my best friend and how our lives had gone different directions, but we still had this bond that was indescribable because we're not two people who are very much alike. And so I sat down and I wrote that play. I finished it, as I said, about 10 years ago. And then I just kind of set it aside. You know, to me, it was a cathartic experience. And I showed it to my friend Paul Sand, and he said, someday I want to direct this. And this was about 3-4 years ago. And every time we would get together, I want to direct that play. We should find a venue. And then it would end at that conversation. And one day he said, do you think we could do that play inside the merry-go-round? He said, you know, at the time I was booking the merry-go-round, so it was easy for me to say yes, you know, we could do something like this in the merry-go-round. But I wasn't imagining it the way he was. We walked into the merry-go-round and he said, what I see is these guys are meeting at this merry-go-round and all the action takes place on it. I thought that's pretty cool. So I immediately went back and rewrote my play to fit on a merry-go-round, which the play now takes place in a defunct amusement park, and it's a merry-go-round that these two characters meet at for the next 15 years and discuss their lives and interact, and still exploring what that friendship really is. And we performed it first time in May of 2017, and then we gave it an 8-week run in February and March this year. It was one of the best experiences of my entire life. The pier has been imagined for all sorts of other uses besides being a pier, and of course we're still doing that today with exploring what we can do in the field of the arts. However, some real innovators have thought of the pier as a place that could be used for energy purposes, and certainly the idea of harnessing waves is one of the first things to come up. There was a woman that lived in one of the apartments above the merry-go-round. Her name was Colleen Creedon, and she imagined what she called a solar pier. And she hired an architect, or actually her friend was an architect. I doubt she even paid him. But they were good enough friends to where he created this solar pier for her, and she was to present it to the city. And this is back in the 1970s. And it was a pier that had solar panels all over it, had wind turbines, because it gets windy here in the afternoon at sunset every day. It's an amazing plan. I've shown it to city staff today in the Environmental Programs Division, and they're still fascinated by it. Colleen Creedon was probably the most interesting and amazing person that lived here. She was a very prominent activist. She threw parties here to support the causes of Daniel Ellsberg and Cesar Chavez. If anybody talks about the wild parties in the pier, they're probably talking about Colleen Creedon. She became such a well-known activist that in 1974, arsonists set fire to trash cans below her apartment, and ultimately to her apartment. And to her dying day, she swears that the arsonists were sent by the government to shut her up. To a very certain segment of Santa Monicans, the pier represents the power of the people, and that segment is the community that saved the pier in the early 1970s, because it was such a grassroots battle over a cause that really seemed hopeless. But it was a bunch of dedicated people who put their collective differences together into their collective similar focus and were able to change what the government had decided to do. And it was a battle, again, of the little guy versus the developers, and the little guy won. And that's pretty cool. And the people who are involved with that still get teary over it today.
I think the Pier is complicated for Santa Monica. I think it's this thing that a lot of people cherish because they've had at least one important memory here on the Pier. But I think a lot of people also sometimes feel like it's not for them anymore and that it's for the guests and the tourists. And we're trying to change that. We're trying to go, no, there is obviously the tourists and we want to serve them and they deserve to have the experience and they deserve to have a meaningful experience. But for the locals, we want to have debates at the end of the Pier on local issues. We want to host people who are Santa Monicans who are doing important things and showcase what it is they're doing here at the Pier. My passion is in new art and new artists, people who are making space for themselves, people who nobody's really asking them to do what they do, they just do it anyway. New art energy is undefined. It is a feeling you get when an artist walks in a room and they look around and they want to try something different that they maybe haven't tried before, or in a space that they've never really created in before. It's a collaboration energy. It's somebody who wants to make something really, really special. A lot of times, the art that ends up in public spaces, unfortunately, are people who have done this for a lifetime and they're kind of phoning it in and going, okay, you can have this piece, which is fair. They've earned the right to do that. But what I am most attracted to is people who are really pushing that boundary and want to become that artist later on in their life. I just love being in a room with an artist and them looking around and their eyes getting bigger and bigger and bigger and the words not really matching up with the energy because they don't know how to define what it is they're going to do yet. I love to be the facilitator of that. I love to shape those thoughts and go, okay, cool, so here's the constraints and here's what we can do and what if we added blue to this and what happens when lights go up and whatever. And that collaboration, I think you can feel it. There's a sense of, again, there's a sense of energy when you're walking through and you can see something that's really new and you go, something's happening here. We've been doing this sort of campaign with these new artists who have no idea that the Pier is somewhere that they can create in. We've been identifying different spaces around the Pier that we can do these experiments with new arts, and they're having a great time and they're letting their friends know, and all of a sudden the Pier is somewhere that's alive with art. So it's very exciting. I like to listen to the space. I like to be here. I like to see what people are doing and what their natural behaviors are. Because a lot of experiential design is really about human psychology and figuring out when do people look where, and when they look there, what can they see when they look there. A lot of my approach is, okay, let's just be here for a minute and let's start experimenting. Let's start throwing things in the mix that, okay, now they're gonna look here and what happens here. And I get all of that data, and then we grow those programs a little bit by a little bit by a little bit until they become what they are. So we're starting small. We're kind of experimenting with filling these spaces and seeing what people react to and what they love, and then we'll make bigger investments in these programs. is an opportunity for us to really be the leaders in diversity for festivals, because we don't have to sell tickets. A lot of festivals have this burden of selling tickets, and so they have to go with artists that are tried and true in very specific ways. Because we don't have to sell tickets, we can throw all of that out the window and really use this opportunity to bring diversity, not just in race, but in age. We can go within music cultures and pick out stuff. And for Twilight on the Pier this year, we are focusing on these different cultures throughout the series. We start with Latin waves, we move on to Australia, we're doing an Afrobeat and R&B night, we're doing island vibes, we end with South Asian night. And we're not only looking at the dominant music cultures from those cultures, which is what usually happens, we're actually looking at the people doing something new within those music cultures. So there's diversity within diversity within diversity. So I'm so excited about that. I think it's going to change the culture a lot of what the Twilight concert series was. We really wanted this experience where you come to the end of the pier and there's a beautiful steel drum, somewhat of an orchestra that's playing. Kind of take in those vibes in this meditative stance and kind of watch the sun go down and just feel like you're in the right place at the right time. So we're really curating it, thinking of somebody who is walking through these different genres and ending at the end of the pier and being like, oh, I'm so glad I came out.
That's good for you though. What's your job?
Sister Mantos is a freak convergence, performance art, musical freak out.
You know, Sister Mantos, like it has that harder groove, and it like really just kind of drives me, especially a good drum rhythm really drives me into craziness.
The cool thing about Sister Mantos is that it changes. Like every show we play, there's a different group of people playing, which is sometimes confusing, sometimes difficult, but mostly really fun. This is like a whole different like wavelength.
You're making music. Maybe you're just doing one simple thing, but that simple thing is adding to the whole ensemble in general, and it's just like... beautiful. Like you may be in your little pocket and then you hear the guitar coming like, and you're like, whoa, what happened? That was awesome. And then you hear Danny doing something on the drums, or somebody dancing, or somebody singing, and bass, everybody. Like, I don't think that you can just listen to one. I think you have to listen to everyone, and it's like that's a whole collectiveness, that's a whole like community that we kind of have going on stage.
We're not traditionalists, and I don't mean that in a way to disrespect. It's more like, you know, we're this weird mutant band, and we look to these other song forms and to these traditional rhythms. We highly respect them and are influenced by them. But since we are people who've grown up in LA and who have a bilingual background, but have been in a bunch of noise bands or experimental bands, these other things start to happen. So Last Night is definitely that idea of a love song. It's about the classic thing about falling in love with someone at the first time you see them. You know, there was that moment when I met someone and I instantly fell in love with them. As unrealistic as that is, it was a place to start writing the song, even though that never actually turned into a relationship and it was just a crush or whatever. It was about thinking about a traditional sound, thinking about like a K-Earth 101 type sound, but reimagined with a noisier guitar and more layers. We are playing with archetypes, but then the intersection is our life as people living in this city who've been part of the underground music movement here. And when the two things collide, that's where our sound is developing.
I take performance very seriously and I'm very intense about it. So my background was actually in orchestral clarinet playing, which sounds really boring, but it's very intense. When you're performing on a stage like in an orchestra, you have a very set job. The dead European man decides what my role is, and the conductor enforces it. There's like zero self-expression. You can't be yourself. Whereas here, I can be myself. My expression of gender is a part of the performance.
I like to write really sad tunes, very like churchy and with like very minimal instruments. But I still like it to be dancey, but I like to like feel like this. Almost crying, but you're happy. Or you're crying and you're dancing all at the same time.
As long as people are dancing, it energizes us to keep going.
Yeah. It's all about the crowd.
Yeah, making people happy, making people feel good.
We love the intergenerational response. It's something that we're learning recently. I've seen like babies and our elders, and it's not a scene. It's like a connection that goes beyond these confines of any scene, and it's something that like an open sky can provide, you know. And we're just grateful to be selected for this, for sure.
So the Wuthering Heights video was a concept that I had come up with. We all love Kate Bush. Her songs are really strange. They don't follow a traditional structure and really difficult to cover. So it was a challenge musically, which was great. I really wanted that challenge. I had this idea of rotating in front of the green screen to kind of create more space and to kind of take us away from four walls. The idea there was really just to kind of focus on the band members and show how beautiful we all were. Again, kind of like loving ourselves, giving ourselves a chance to be beautiful, and also to exaggerate a little bit, to be also have a sense of humor. The hair was done by Kate Gilbert, who's another artist collaborator, and that actually was the magic touch. It's stereotypical, but this idea of like a femininity associated with flowers is something that I also wanted to investigate and give it space and also give it power. So yeah, those are some of the things that were involved in that. There's something about playing a free all ages show in a place like the Santa Monica Pier. People are gonna come there. It's a magnet. I think one of the great things about that festival was that it was free, all ages. And then that was really written on all the flyers. That's exactly the kind of place we wanna be in. Places that aren't all ages. That means that, a really excited 16-year-old who loves music can't go to the show. It's crucial for us, like culturally, to have places like that. Handicap accessible, that have ramps. Everyone should be able to see shows. Everyone should be able to participate. We have to make more places open like that.
This is one you might know if you've ever been to a quinceañera. Who's ever been to a quinceañera before? Well, we changed the lyrics around from La Negra Tomasa to La Marciana Tomasa because some of us are aliens. Will always be. So when we get to that part, you can sing along Marciana Tomasa.
Marciana song, Caifanes made it really popular in rock en español. And it's like this song that kind of mixes the very traditional cumbia element with alternative music. So you had all of us like Chicano kids going crazy over that at quinceañeras and weddings. Like if they played that song, like it was all over. Cumbias is really traditionally like, I guess like you could dance it with a partner, but also like women dance by themselves. And it's in these Latin cultures, it's very women dancing by themselves. Oh, they must be lesbian. They must be like old hags that will never get married or something. So that song in itself was very empowering for a lot of us. That era of music was like the first time that we heard that kind of mix. So it was major for us.
There's something about the way that we've come together as a band. We're really going into kind of the city that we live in and in the communities that we live in and who we are. And that means people who are, maybe, again, first generation immigrants, second generation, speak multiple languages, have multiple gender identities. And we've really tried to shine a light on how beautiful and powerful that is. We're doing that so that other people can feel empowered, feel liberated by it, and also be motivated to make music and to make art or to protest stuff or to study, whatever it is, the thing that they're doing. The fact that there was bands like Rage Against the Machine or even at the drive-in, I came a little later, those were huge influences for me and also for John, because we were able to see people who looked like us making music that was huge and powerful, and we're also able to talk about their culture. No one has to tell us to do it. It's just naturally going to happen. And I do believe that music is a tool for empowerment and for liberation, whether it's internally or globally. And yeah, I think that's something that's a kind of a thread that's carried through no matter what we're doing with the music.